Welcome to the Books and Travel podcast. I'm Jo Frances Penn, thriller and dark fantasy author, bringing you escape and inspiration about unusual and fascinating places, as well as the deeper side of books and travel. You can find the episode show notes at booksandtravel.page, and if you enjoy thrillers set in international locations, download one of my ebooks for free at jfpen.com/free. Hello travellers, I'm Jo Frances Penn, and yes, the podcast is back. I have missed talking to other writers about travel and the places that inspire us, and many of you have told me that you enjoy the show. So I am really excited to be back with Books and Travel, and I already have lots of new guests lined up for interviews on fascinating places as well as the deeper side of books and travel, and of course book recommendations as well. So as this is the first episode for a while, several years in fact, I am doing a solo episode today and including some clips from other guests where I'll go through why I originally started this podcast and why I am now restarting the show, thoughts on why we travel, reinvention, curiosity, different perspectives on places, especially when we are outsiders, as well as finding beauty closer to home, and of course, memento mori. Remember, you will die, and why that perspective shapes so much of what I do. I would love to know your thoughts on the show or about a particular episode, and I'd love to see photos of where you're listening, wherever you are in the world. You can email me, joanna@jfpen.com. And if you want to see photos of my travels, I'm on Instagram @jfpenauthor. Right, let's get into it. Curiosity, reinvention and inspiration. The return of books and travel. 6 years ago, in February 2019, I released the first episode of this podcast in a solo show entitled Lake Malawi, Jerusalem and Blue Water Sailing to Vanuatu, the 3 trips that changed my life. And I'm going to play the opening clip as it relates to why I am now restarting the show again. This show is all about reinvention, which is also part of what travel means to me. But when I think about what I want to do with my life for the next 10 years, I like to think about the 10-year span, because if we commit to doing things for 10 years, amazing stuff happens that we may never have expected. So when I think about my life, the main thing that stays the same is books and travel. These are the things I come back to again and again, the things I truly, truly love. I'm also fascinated by the inner and outer journeys that both books and travel can bring. So a change in perspective, an empathy, perhaps an entirely new direction in your life because of something you've read or somewhere you've been or something you've experienced. And so if you know what I mean, then I hope that you're going to enjoy this new podcast. I'm also going to write 2 books from this material over time, and I have been thinking about a travel memoir for many years, and also I've talked about what is a working title, The Shadow Book, which is very much about creating from the dark side of ourselves. And I've wanted to write these books for many years. They've been bubbling away, and yet I have not made time for those to emerge. So partly this podcast is me giving time to these books. I don't know what is memoir or what is shadow book at the moment, but I know that by creating this material this way, I will be able to tap into things that I have not tapped into before. And that in itself is quite exciting. I'm also a little scared because it will mean being very transparent, being open about things I haven't shared necessarily before. I might have written about in a fictionalized way, but you might never know what's true and what's not true. So I will be talking about those things on this show over time. It's fascinating to revisit that first episode now because I feel like reinvention is at the heart of why I have started this show again. As this goes out, I'm about to turn 50. I've been a professional full-time author since 2011. I've written almost 50 books and short stories across multiple genres as J.F. Penn and Joanna Penn, and I finally feel like I have the creative confidence to step in a new direction. The 2 books I mentioned that I wanted to write in that clip are now out in the world. Pilgrimage, Lessons Learned from Solo Walking 3 Ancient Ways is my midlife travel memoir, written mostly over the pandemic years when I did multi-day walks that kept me sane and helped me find my way again in difficult times. And there are lots of episodes on walking and pilgrimage in the backlist. That was also my first Kickstarter campaign and my first beautiful hardback book with colour photos of my travels. And in fact, you can still get that at jfpennbooks.com. My thoughts on the Camino de Santiago and an excerpt from the audiobook are also in the backlist. My shadow book came soon after. The full title is Writing the Shadow, Turn Your Inner Darkness into Words. And by writing that pilgrimage memoir, I was able to tap into the more personal side of my writing. That process released a lot of blocks for me. So if you're writing a memoir, then I hope you persist, as it's certainly one of the hardest, but also one of the most rewarding genres to write. So both of those books scared me during the writing process and also scared me during the marketing for sure once they were out in the world. Both of them contain vulnerabilities I haven't shared anywhere else. They changed my writing, taking it into deeper waters, which is part of my aim with conversations in this show. Which brings me back to the metaphor of the ocean, which I use on the podcast logo and which characterises the content of the podcast and also the articles I post on booksandtravel.page. Here's another snippet from that first episode which expands on this. I'm starting this with an intention, but we'll see where it goes. I do have a metaphor though, which is the ocean. And the ocean is going to definitely come into many of these episodes. But I want to do 2 aspects in this show. First of all, the dappled light of turquoise shallows. And I want you to picture that in your mind. You're safe, you're maybe just paddling, you've got your feet in, you're in the sun, you've got a cocktail in your hand or a fruit juice or whatever you like to drink, and sparkling water, wine. You're enjoying the simple joys of a new place. And so I will be talking about my travels and also interviewing authors around the places that inspire our writing. And we will talk about food and drink and the lighter side of travel, which will help you explore. We'll also be looking at what books you might like to read about places. So that will be the lighter side of travel. But I also want to explore what I'm calling the dark midnight depths. And that to me is that edge of challenge and a pull to the deep and some mystery and the things that are that little bit darker around travel. It's not all sweetness and light. It's not all cocktails and tapas. We go to travel and we go to books for that challenge, for a change, for deeper meaning. And so I want to explore perhaps what is the most important exploration of all, which is the inner transformation, the inner journey. So I'll be talking about both of those things. So why do we travel? Whether it's in person or in our minds through books and listening to people on podcasts like this, or in movies and films and photos and social media. In an interview on the meaning of travel, philosopher Emily Thomas gave her thoughts.
For me, traveling is all about experiencing otherness. It's all about going to places that are new and unfamiliar and trying to figure out how to make sense of them, how to map them onto the world that you do know. And so my best travel experiences have actually been ones where I have gone to some place where I haven't understood anything around me, not the language, not what's going on in the street, not the social cues. And I have very slowly, by reading and talking to people, come to put the pieces together and come to understand a place.
One of the reasons I travel is curiosity. It drives me in terms of research around the books I want to write and the stories I want to tell. So much so that I will say this now because I do want to write a book on curiosity at some point. So hopefully it will spill out of this show, much as Pilgrimage and the Shadow Book did in the last batch of interviews I did. Hopefully it won't take 6 years. In an interview on curiosity, wonder and serendipity, I talked to Steve Brock about hidden travel, and I asked him how people can tap into their curiosity.
Well, it starts with knowing what it is that you actually love. And believe it or not, most human beings don't know what it is that they really deeply, truly love. We're so keyed into distractions that we don't really know what our deep passions are. One of the ways to do that is to think of a trip as a learning laboratory. So you have this opportunity to explore your interest. I talked to one person who has a friend, she loves roller coasters. And so she plans all of her trips around amusement parks around the world. And you think, okay, well, that's a nice little hobby. But the fun thing about that is that she has connected now with this entire community of roller coaster aficionados. And she has found her tribe, if you will. And so part of it has led to not just new places and destinations, but that curiosity has grown into relationships that she really treasures. And she has some great friends as a result of that. So one thing I think it's important for people to remember is that curiosity is not the same for everybody, nor is any single person curious about everything. I may be curious about, for example, history type of things, as you're curious about cemeteries. So know what it is that you're curious about. Use your trip as a way to explore that curiosity because it gives you the freedom to practice things you would not do at home. So I may take a cooking class on a trip that I would never take at home, or I may explore a new type of physical activity like kayaking on a trip that I just wouldn't do at home. So use the freedom that you have there from the routine to not only spark that curiosity, but to pursue that curiosity.
I certainly pursue my curiosity for the seeds of my stories, and all my books as JF Penn have been inspired by my travels or places I've read about. My arcane thrillers are truly international in scope, from the burning ghats of Varanasi, India, in the first scene of my first thriller, Stone of Fire, to Vienna, Nuremberg, and Washington, D.C. in Spear of Destiny, the most recent adventure. As this goes out anyway. My Map Walker fantasy adventures were inspired by an antique map shop here in my city of Bath, when I wondered what might happen if I could walk through the ancient map into a world off the edge of our own. Might I find the places written off our maps somehow, and the people and the creatures that end up there? My Brooke and Daniel crime thrillers are based in modern-day London and resonate with the history of the city, and there is an episode where I talk about my history with London, as I've lived there several times, and you can listen to that in the backlist. My standalone stories are all over the shop, from Death Valley, set in California, which is coming out soon, to Seahenge on the Norfolk coast, to New Zealand for Risen Gods, and the biodynamic vineyards of Somerset for Blood Vintage. Everywhere I go, I find places and people and artefacts and myths that spark story. And part of this show is talking to authors who also experience the same thing. In Catnip for a Novelist, I talk to thriller and fantasy author Leighton Green about how he uses his travels in book research. I love talking to Leighton, as his Dominic Gray thrillers are similar to my arcane thrillers, and we've written about some of the same places, even though we are very different people, so they always come out in a different way.
Often I will plan my books around where I want to travel, but of course, if the narrative takes me elsewhere, I'll follow the narrative. But usually they intertwine really closely. And you can always work a place into the plot that you haven't been before, that you want to go. But a lot of my novels, as I'm getting into the plot and writing the story, things will come up or places will come up that I want to visit, and I'll just decide, okay, it's on. That's going to be where I'm going, and that's part of the story. I've found that for me, the best way is to take notes as I travel. I take some pictures, but I never look at them for writing. I will take my little moleskin notebook and my pen, and definitely the best part of my job. And I'll just go to a place and I'll walk around and I'll record my thoughts and impressions. And that I've found leads to my best writing. I think a hallmark of my writing is that I try to stay as true as possible, especially when it comes to setting. And the only caveat to that is that the old parable of the blind men touching an elephant, where they'll each touch a different part of the elephant. So they'll come away with a vastly different conception of what an elephant is. I think it's a little bit like that with, take Zimbabwe, for example. I've been very pleased to know that people from Zimbabwe have liked that book and the descriptions of it. But it's probably written more for people that have not been to Zimbabwe or have only been a little bit. I've had plenty of books where I've had locals tell me, that isn't how this place is. And I'm thinking, actually, it is. It was just my perception of it. What I wrote about was true in its own way.
I love that phrase, what I wrote about was true in its own way. And this attitude applies to both fiction and memoir, and anything that is fixed in time, because everything changes, and we change too. And that's part of why I love these conversations, because everyone has a different perspective, and we get to dip in and, just for a little while, try to experience something in a different way. In a conversation with literary fiction author Ros Morris, she talks about how she didn't even know how much place affected her stories until writing her memoir.
I hadn't realised how much, actually, until I wrote Not Quite Lost, because I went back through a diary that I'd kept and I found the seeds of my novels in that diary from travels I'd done 20 years before I actually wrote the novels. And I hadn't realised how far those experiences and the impressions they'd given me, I hadn't realised how far they'd stayed with me. And so that's quite a revelation. I found that my novel Lifeform 3, which is about, it's set in an unspecified time in the future when all the countryside has gone, except there is one country estate that's been preserved because it belonged to somebody. And it has trees and valleys and hills and a ruined house in a wood. And there's nowhere else left like that in the entire country. And that came from the travels I'd written about in this diary and had forgotten about. So environment really inspires me. When you're with horses, they make you very aware of the environment. And so I noticed the different colours of grass changing all the time and leaf buds and things like that. And a horse makes you very aware of it because a horse experiences the environment in a very different way. It can hear things that you don't even know are there. It notices smells and sounds that you don't know are there. So it makes you very aware of your environment. And I thought one day as I was riding on an old path, and I thought, under this path are probably the footprints of other people on horses maybe. And it just made me feel there was a huge story about buried things and things that had gone. And it was the horse that made me realise that we have this connection to nature. And then I thought, what if you wrote about a place where all that had nearly gone and horses are like a conduit back to it?
I love that Ros talks there about being on a horse as a different way to experience a place. I'm allergic to horses, so I'm never going to write from that perspective, but it's good to consider how you can have an experience of travel without having to cross the world to some far-off place. It's more like an attitude. And you can always see places near you with new eyes, which we all learned about in the pandemic when we couldn't go so far. In an interview with Brianna Madia, we talked about the unexpected road to an unconventional life. And she talked about finding beautiful places close to home and looking at things in a new way.
I think that we get comfortable, and especially now with social media, we look online and we think that travel has to be a week holiday in a tropical place, or you have to be taking a selfie on an airplane in order to be traveling. And there were so many beautiful places that I could have easily gotten to over the weekend back in Connecticut. And I'm embarrassed at how little I explored where I actually grew up. And I think a lot of people feel that way. You just tend to fall into this routine of like, oh, I've probably seen it all. And I think that that's another reason that I've fallen so in love with the desert, is I just know it's such a classic example of a landscape where it's impossible to have seen it all. You can always look and find something new. And I wish I had applied that thinking to the place that I grew up, because I believe there's beautiful things everywhere.
So we all find different things beautiful. And one of my endless fascinations is with aspects of Gothic and death culture. Gothic architecture, graveyards, ossuaries, crypts, dark travel, ruins. I am basically like Wednesday from the Addams Family, and if you've seen that show on Netflix, I'm definitely like Wednesday on the inside. I don't dress that way. I am a vanilla goth. You would never know it to look at me. But while some people think these interests are morbid, others see memento mori, remember you will die, as a way to live harder, to live more in the present, and to make the most of every day. In my interview with Lauren Rhodes, we discussed being life-obsessed and talked about our favourite places to visit, and that episode is all about cemeteries and graveyards.
I don't think it's morbid at all. And then somebody will accuse me of being death-obsessed, and for me, it's the opposite. I am life-obsessed. I know we've just got a certain number of days, so why wouldn't you spend it out in the sunshine listening to birdsong and looking at beautiful art? What have you got to do with your life that's better than that? Yeah, I don't know. I just don't see cemeteries as morbid at all. I think it's beautiful that we remember people. There are all these amazing stories in the cemetery that you can learn with a tour guide is the best way, but even just walking around and looking at the stones and reading the lovely old names and trying to make guesses about the iconography and their days of birth and death. I don't know. It's a way of connecting with the past that looking at architecture doesn't do for me. Don't let a day pass, because you have a gift to bring to the world.
So I love that attitude of being life-obsessed. And part of what I love about life is travelling and reading, which brings me back to why I'm rebooting this show and why I already have interviews planned with different guests and also some solo episodes coming too. I'm planning to release a new episode every second week, and you can also have a listen to the backlist. There are over 90 episodes. Most are interviews around a book or a place or a mode of travel or an attitude or a philosophy. Some are solo shows where I talk about places I've lived and the places that inspire my books. Every episode is evergreen, so you can listen at any time. There's nothing time sensitive. I hope that you can escape virtually and enjoy travelling away, even in your mind. And of course, there are book recommendations in every episode. There's a transcript and photos and links. Everything is at booksandtravel.page/listen. You can find my books and stories at jfpennbooks.com and also on the usual stores. I also narrate some of my own stories now, and most are available in audio on all the major platforms. I'd love to hear what you think about the show, as well as any questions or book recommendations or ideas for future episodes. And I would love to see pictures of where you're listening. You can email me, jo@booksandtravel.page. That's jo@booksandtravel.page. And you can also follow me on Instagram at jfpennauthor. Happy travels, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for joining me today on the Books and Travel podcast. I hope you found a moment of escape. You can find the episode show notes at booksandtravel.page, And if you enjoy thrillers set in international locations, download one of my books for free at jfpen.com/free. Happy travels until next time.